It began with a statement so brief that most people overlooked it. Yet inside palace corridors, the reaction was immediate. Senior aides exchanged uneasy glances, longtime courtiers fell silent, and royal insiders suddenly found themselves answering questions they had hoped would never be asked. Something unprecedented had happened, and for Queen Camilla, the consequences were only beginning. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, Buckingham Palace tried to make the announcement sound routine, almost administrative, the kind of carefully polished wording that disappears beneath heavier headlines. But this time, every phrase carried weight. The reference to royal duty, the careful absence of certain familiar language, and the sudden shift in how Camilla's position was described created a silence louder than any public scandal. Reports suggest that within minutes, royal observers began comparing the wording to earlier palace statements, searching for what had been removed rather than what had been said. That was when the whispers began. Had Charles truly stepped back from the title that once symbolized Camilla's full acceptance into the monarchy? Had the palace quietly signaled that Queen Consort was no longer being protected with the same force? For the public, it was confusing. For insiders, it was explosive, because titles in the House of Windsor are never just decorations. They are shields, weapons, promises, and warnings. And when one is altered, softened, or stripped of meaning, it usually means something far deeper has already broken behind the gates. Senior aides reportedly moved quickly, not to celebrate the statement, but to contain it. Phones rang, messages were tightened, courtiers were told to stay disciplined. But the more the palace tried to keep the language controlled, the more dangerous the silence became. Royal correspondents began asking why the announcement had been issued now, why the wording felt so deliberate, and why Camilla's place inside the royal structure suddenly seemed open to interpretation. Some compared it to old title battles that once shook the monarchy, when public image, private loyalty, and constitutional symbolism collided with devastating force. Others whispered Charles had been forced into a decision he had avoided for years. And that was the true shock. Not that a statement had been released, but that it appeared to carry the shadow of a royal correction. A warning from the institution itself that personal loyalty could no longer stand above the crown. For Camilla, who had survived decades of criticism and finally reached the summit beside Charles, the implication was brutal. The crown she had fought so long to wear now seemed surrounded by questions, and those questions were spreading faster than the palace could silence them. But the statement itself was only the surface of the story. The real battle had been unfolding behind closed doors for months. Long before the public heard a single word, whispers of tension had already spread through royal circles. What appeared to be a united front was, according to insiders, increasingly difficult to maintain. Behind formal appearances and carefully staged events, a struggle over influence, legacy, and authority was quietly reshaping the future of the monarchy. Reports suggest the divide did not begin with one dramatic clash, but with a slow accumulation of uneasy small disagreements, careful silences, and conversations that ended the moment certain names entered the room. Charles, already carrying the heavy burden of kingship while facing serious health pressures, was said to be surrounded by competing voices. Some urged patience. Others warned that patience had become dangerous. The monarchy, they argued, could not afford another confusion over titles, roles, and public trust, especially when every royal gesture was being examined with sharper eyes than ever before. Camilla's role, once presented as settled after the coronation, now seemed to be placed under a colder light. Not because the palace wanted open conflict, but because senior figures reportedly feared that the meaning of her position had begun drifting beyond what the institution could comfortably defend. To the public, Queen Consort sounded like a matter of wording. Inside the palace, it carried a deeper weight. It touched history, duty, legitimacy, and the delicate promise made after years of public resistance that the monarchy would remain larger than any personal story. But behind closed doors, that promise was becoming harder to protect. Different factions reportedly formed around different futures. One side believed Camilla's status should remain untouched to preserve Charles's dignity and avoid humiliation. Another side believed the crown had already paid too high a price for ambiguity, and that allowing uncertainty to grow would weaken the reign at its most vulnerable moment. Senior advisors began revisiting old constitutional traditions, studying how previous royal consorts were defined, how titles had been granted, softened, or restricted, and how the public had responded when private relationships collided with national symbolism. It was not simply a question of affection. It was a question of survival. Because Charles could be loyal to his wife, but the monarchy had to be loyal to itself. And that was where the tension became almost impossible to ignore. Insiders claim the king found himself caught between two brutal realities: the personal pain of stepping back from the woman who had stood beside him for decades, and the institutional pressure to protect a crown already bruised by scandal, illness, and public doubt. Every option carried damage. Every delay carried risk. The palace could pretend all was calm, but those who understood the machinery of royalty knew the truth. Something had shifted. A title that once looked secure was becoming the center of a silent war. As tensions mounted, attention turned toward a series of private meetings that would ultimately change everything. Few people knew the meetings were taking place. Fewer still knew what was being discussed. Yet, according to palace sources, a small group of trusted advisors began examining options that would have been considered unthinkable only a few years earlier. The future of one of the monarchy's most visible titles was suddenly under review. At the center of it all was Charles, a king already carrying the weight of public duty, private illness, and a family history that had never fully stopped haunting him. Reports suggest the consultations began quietly, almost cautiously, as if everyone in the room understood that even speaking about the matter carried danger. This was not ordinary palace housekeeping. This was the kind of conversation that touched the deepest nerves of monarchy. Who stands beside the sovereign, what that position means, and whether public trust can survive when symbolism becomes clouded. Constitutional advisors were reportedly brought in not to create drama, but to prevent a greater one. They examined past reigns, old consort traditions, palace wording, coronation expectations, and the delicate line between personal dignity and institutional necessity. Every precedent seemed to offer a warning. Titles could strengthen a reign, but they could also expose its weakest point. And for Charles, that weakness was impossible to ignore. Camilla had been his companion through decades of scandal, endurance, and eventual acceptance. Yet the monarchy was not built on romance. It was built on continuity. It survived by protecting itself from emotion when emotion threatened to blur the crown's authority. That was the cruel truth sitting beneath every private discussion. Senior royals reportedly raised concerns about what the next era would look like, especially as William and Catherine's roles grew more central to the public imagination. Would the monarchy enter the succession years with a title dispute hanging over it? Would future generations inherit confusion instead of clarity? Would the crown appear strong, or would it look as though it had bent too far around one personal story? These questions reportedly hardened the mood. What began as legal caution slowly became strategic concern. Advisors understood that the words used around Camilla mattered because the country had been promised stability. If that promise began to feel uncertain, the damage could stretch beyond one household and into the heart of the institution itself. Charles, according to insiders, resisted the emotional finality of what was being discussed. He knew the human cost. To review Camilla's title was to reopen old wounds, to invite public debate, and to risk humiliating the woman who had waited years to stand beside him. But the pressure around him kept tightening. The palace was no longer asking whether the matter was uncomfortable. It was asking whether avoiding it had become more dangerous than confronting it. And slowly, almost painfully, momentum began to shift. The unthinkable was no longer being dismissed. It was being prepared. But before any decision could be finalized, an unexpected event accelerated the process dramatically. Then came the incident that insiders describe as the turning point. What had been a private debate suddenly became impossible to ignore. The atmosphere inside palace walls reportedly changed overnight, transforming a slow-moving discussion into an urgent matter demanding immediate action. According to those familiar with the mood around the palace, the controversy did not arrive as a single thunderclap, but as the final spark falling onto months of dry tension. Public reaction had already been sharpening. Every appearance, every title, every mention of Camilla's role was being measured against the promise of stability that had followed the coronation. Then one fresh wave of criticism reportedly pushed the matter beyond private discomfort and into open institutional danger. Advisors began warning that the monarchy could not keep absorbing confusion without consequence. The title that had once been treated as settled was now becoming a lightning rod. And with Charles's health still a concern in the public mind, the palace faced a brutal question. Could it afford to let uncertainty linger at the very top? Reports suggest senior aides began preparing risk assessments that went far beyond ordinary public relations. This was not about one bad headline or one difficult week. It was about legacy damage. It was about whether the monarchy looked disciplined or divided, whether the next generation would inherit clarity or chaos, whether the crown itself appeared to be led by duty or trapped by personal loyalty. Charles, according to insiders, was urged to act not as a husband, but as a sovereign. That distinction carried enormous emotional force. For decades, his loyalty to Camilla had been one of the defining battles of his life. Yet now, the same loyalty that once seemed like endurance was being tested against the cold demands of the institution. Senior family members reportedly rallied behind the argument that the monarchy had to protect its structure before it protected anyone's feelings. The comparison to past royal crises became unavoidable. Courtiers remembered how quickly public trust could collapse when titles became symbols of privilege rather than service. They understood that once the public begins asking whether a role has gone too far, silence no longer looks dignified. It looks weak. And weakness inside the royal system can spread like a crack through ancient stone. Behind the scenes, final recommendations were reportedly shaped with careful, almost unforgiving precision. The palace would not frame the move as punishment. It would frame it as correction. Not rejection, but recalibration. Not scandal, but survival. Yet everyone involved understood the deeper meaning. To alter the language around Camilla's title was to send a message across the entire royal world. The crown was drawing a line. Charles may have hesitated, but the machine around him had begun moving with a force that even he could not easily stop. What had started as a quiet review had become a royal emergency. And the next document placed before him would carry the weight of history. The recommendation placed before the king was extraordinary, and its implications would send shockwaves across the royal world. For years, King Charles had balanced loyalty, duty, and personal relationships. Now he faced a choice that would define his reign. Those closest to the palace say the decision was neither quick nor easy, but once it was made, there would be no turning back. The final proposals were reportedly placed before him, with a kind of careful language that makes royal decisions feel calm on paper, even when they are tearing through private lives beneath the surface. Every option carried a wound. To do nothing risked leaving the monarchy trapped in uncertainty. To act risked opening a public storm around Camilla's position, reopening old arguments many believed had finally been buried after the coronation. But Charles was no longer being asked to protect comfort. He was being asked to protect continuity. That distinction, insiders suggest, changed everything. The private consultations that had stretched across weeks now reached their hard conclusion. Advisors had reviewed history, public mood, legal tradition, and the fragile optics of a reign shaped by illness, transition, and doubt. Senior voices reportedly told the king that the crown could not remain hostage to personal emotion, not when the future of the institution depended on clean lines and unquestioned authority. Charles understood the cruelty of the moment. Camilla had stood beside him through humiliation, criticism, and decades of waiting. Yet the throne is not a reward for endurance. It is a sacred burden, and in that burden, even love must sometimes bow to duty. Historical legacy weighed heavily on him. He knew every reign is remembered by the choices made under pressure. not the speeches delivered in comfort. He knew his mother's shadow still stretched across every royal decision, a reminder that the monarchy survives not because it avoids pain, but because it absorbs pain in silence. Reports suggest the final statement was drafted with extreme caution, each phrase polished until it revealed just enough and concealed even more. It could not sound vindictive, it could not look chaotic. It had to appear measured, constitutional, almost inevitable. Behind that careful wording, however, was a thunderous message. Camilla's role would no longer be allowed to define the crown's future on emotional terms alone. Palace teams reportedly prepared for the fallout before the announcement was approved. Media briefings were tightened. Senior aides rehearsed responses. Loyalists were warned not to inflame speculation. Everyone understood that once the words left Buckingham Palace, there would be no easy way to pull them back. Charles's approval was not presented as triumph, but as surrender to something older and colder than personal loyalty, the survival instinct of the monarchy itself. And in that moment, the king, who had spent a lifetime fighting for acceptance, found himself forced to accept the harshest truth of all. The crown gives, but it can also take away. The announcement was cleared for release, and with it, a private royal crisis became a public earthquake. Yet the public state was only the beginning, because the reaction that followed proved even more dramatic. The announcement may have carried the king's authority, but its emotional impact was felt most deeply elsewhere. Palace insiders immediately began describing scenes of shock, disbelief, and intense private discussions as the reality of the decision became impossible to ignore. For Camilla, the moment was reportedly not just political, it was personal. After decades of public judgment, careful rehabilitation, and eventual acceptance beside Charles, the idea that her title could suddenly become a matter of correction struck like a blow. No palace wording could soften. Reports suggest close allies moved quickly to understand what the statement truly meant. Whether this was a symbolic adjustment, a formal distancing, or the beginning of a wider change in how her role would be presented. But uncertainty only made the situation more painful. Because when a royal title is questioned, the silence around it becomes louder than any official explanation. Within hours, speculation began racing through newspapers, broadcasters, and royal commentators. Some argued that Charles had acted with painful courage, choosing the crown over personal comfort at a moment when the monarchy needed firmness. Others saw it as a humiliating retreat, a cold message to a woman who had already endured years of public hostility. The divide was sharp because Camilla herself had always been a complicated figure in the national imagination. To supporters, she represented loyalty, patience, and resilience. To critics, she remained tied to an older wound the monarchy had never fully healed. Now, the announcement seemed to reopen both views at once, turning one palace statement into a national argument about legitimacy, forgiveness, and power. Public opinion became fiercely divided. Every future appearance suddenly carried new meaning. Would Camilla stand beside Charles with the same authority? Would programs, invitations, and official references quietly change? Would palace staff avoid certain phrases? These were not small questions, they were signals. And inside the royal system, signals matter. Insiders claim the palace worked urgently to maintain stability, reminding aides that dignity must be preserved even while the institution adjusted. Its language. There could be no open fracture, no emotional outburst, no visible surrender to chaos. Yet behind that discipline was a harsher truth. The monarchy had entered dangerous territory, where every gesture risked being interpreted as either defiance or defeat. Camilla's allies reportedly feared that if the narrative hardened too quickly, she could be pushed from symbol of royal endurance into symbol of royal limitation. That was the emotional cost hidden beneath the constitutional language. Charles's decision may have been framed as duty, but duty leaves bruises. And those bruises were now being felt across the palace, through private loyalties, old resentments, and the uneasy awareness that a title once seen as settled had become the center of a new royal storm. As headlines spread around the world, attention shifted to a much larger question: what would this mean for the future of the monarchy itself? Royal history is filled with moments that changed everything. Many observers believe this may become one of them. With the controversy dominating headlines, senior royals reportedly began focusing not on the past, but on what comes next. The shock around Camilla's title had opened a wider conversation inside the palace, one that went far beyond one statement or one wounded figure. It forced the monarchy to ask where its strength would come from in the years ahead. And increasingly, attention turned toward William and Catherine, not because they had demanded the spotlight, but because the future was already moving toward them. Reports suggest advisors began studying how the next generation could carry stability without inheriting the confusion of the present reign. Every appearance by William now seemed loaded with quiet meaning. Every act of Catherine's restraint felt like part of a larger promise, that the crown could still present discipline, service, and calm even when private storms raged behind it. The palace, insiders claim, understood that public expectations had changed. People no longer accepted titles simply because tradition said they mattered. They wanted purpose. They wanted clarity. They wanted to believe that the royal family knew the difference between privilege and responsibility. That was why the Camilla decision became so important. It was not just about removing or reshaping one title. It was about proving that the monarchy could correct itself before public trust collapsed. Long-term reforms reportedly became part of private discussion. Advisors examined how royal roles should be described, how future consorts should be positioned, and how the institution could avoid another cycle of emotional debate turning into constitutional confusion. Legacy planning, once a distant concern, became urgent. Charles's reign, already marked by illness and transition, had to become a bridge rather than a battlefield. William and Catherine's future could not be built on unresolved tension. It needed clean foundations, careful language, and a renewed sense that duty came before personal comfort. That was the message senior royals reportedly rallied around. Stability, continuity, discipline. Not as empty words, but as survival tools. Because once the crown appears uncertain about its own symbols, every critic gains power. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every title becomes a question. And the monarchy cannot live forever in explanation. It must eventually stand with authority. As the headline spread, the palace worked to project calm, but beneath that calm was a deep awareness that a new chapter had begun. Camilla's changed position had created pain, but it had also forced the institution to choose direction. The future would not be shaped only by who stood beside Charles. It would be shaped by who could carry the crown after him without confusion, without apology, and without the shadows of old battles darkening the road ahead. But perhaps the most revealing lesson of all was hidden within the decision itself. In royal history, titles are never just titles. They represent power, symbolism, legitimacy, and legacy. That is why this moment has captured such extraordinary attention. Whether celebrated or criticized, the decision will likely be remembered as one of the defining chapters of Charles's reign. Because beneath the formal language and careful palace wording was a truth the monarchy has always understood. A title only survives when the institution believes it strengthens the crown. Once that belief begins to fracture, even the most elevated name can become vulnerable. For Charles, this moment will not be judged only by whether it pleased supporters or angered critics. It will be judged by whether it protected the monarchy at a time when stability mattered more than sentiment. Reports suggest that was the argument that finally shaped the decision. Not revenge, not humiliation, not a sudden act of personal coldness, but the old royal law of survival. The crown must outlast every private attachment. That principle has haunted generations of monarchs before him. Some paid for it with silence, others paid with loneliness. But all of them learned that royalty is built on sacrifice disguised as ceremony. Camilla's title had carried years of emotional history, from scandal to acceptance, from rejection to coronation glory. Yet in the end, the palace appeared to decide that no personal journey, however long, could be allowed to overshadow the future direction of the monarchy. That is what made the decision so powerful and so painful at the same time. It showed Charles not simply as a husband defending a companion, but as a king being forced to choose the institution over the story that had defined much of his life. And that choice will follow his reign. Supporters may argue that he acted with courage, cutting through confusion before it could damage the succession. Critics may call it harsh, even devastating, a public wound delivered through polished royal language. But history rarely remembers royal decisions by how gentle they felt in the moment. It remembers whether they preserved the line, protected the symbols, and kept the crown moving forward. Now the future turns toward William, Catherine, and the next chapter of royal authority. The lesson left behind is unmistakable. The monarchy can tolerate controversy, but it cannot survive uncertainty forever. Titles may shine, but duty decides how long they last. Alliances may appear strong, but the institution is stronger. And while the storm around Camilla may eventually fade from the headlines, the message beneath it will remain inside the walls of the House of Windsor like a warning passed from one reign to the next. Because in the end, royal titles may change, alliances may shift, and controversies may fade, but the struggle over legacy inside the House of Windsor never truly ends. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.